It all began with a stone, or so the legend says. In ages past, a sentient jewel, enormous and beautiful, banished the darkness.
Final Fantasy is a legendary RPG franchise, spanning 16 mainline numbered titles and many more spin-offs, with many of the games taking the form of single-player adventures of some kind. Playing through all 16 of the numbered games is mostly pretty straightforward, and has been a goal of mine for some time, but there are two titles that would have stood in the way of a single-player-minded RPG enjoyer looking to do the same. The younger and more contemporary of the two, Final Fantasy XIV, is arguably far less of a challenge than its older and much more obtuse and nigh impenetrable brother, the revered Final Fantasy XI. Hello and welcome to The Backlog, a series where I tackle older games from any era that I have had on my radar but just never got around to playing yet. An issue I'm sure many of you can relate to. In this series, I'll play a game in full, or at least reasonably full enough, and see how it holds up and what I think about playing it in the modern day. Each game will be scored on a scale of 1 to 5 in 3 categories: gameplay, narrative, and presentation, with all 3 being added together for a final score of 15. In this first ever episode, I wind the clock back to 2002, sort of, as I tackle Final Fantasy's first online adventure, an attempt to grapple with the antiquated systems and slower paced action than many other MMOs available today. Final Fantasy XI first released in 2002 in Japan, and is pretty unique among MMOs as it was playable, and was primarily designed for, the PlayStation 2. That's right, a PlayStation 2 MMO. When the game was first announced, it actually raised several eyebrows on Square's decision to declare it as the 11th numbered Final Fantasy, instead of kind of putting it to the side with a name like Final Fantasy Online or something, which funny enough would have probably never drawn me to play it if it really did release without a number, so hey, I guess it worked. The game was a concerted, company-wide effort pulling several studios under Square's umbrella to make not just the game happen, but also cook up the network system required to support user accounts and online services. Good old Play Online, which I'll get into a bit later. Now you may be wondering, how does an MMO, a game with a network and patching requirement, even run on something like the PS2? The answer? This thing right here. The PS2 network adapter, which fit right into the original model's expansion slot. That's right, if you didn't know, the original model of PS2 did have an expansion slot. If you still have one, go and check it out. There were several other games that the network adapter supported, but the PS2 version of Final Fantasy XI was actually sold with this thing since it was required. If you have heard anything about 11, you may have heard that just getting access to the game is one of the biggest challenges, as navigating the account management system and Play Online is a labyrinth of antiquated and outdated software and account creation. Along with this, being an MMO, there are several other considerations to take into account before even trying to play, but all of that can wait for now. Let's actually get into what you'll be doing once you arrive in the world of Vana'diel. This section of the video doesn't only cover core gameplay like combat, but other systems as well. Upon launching the game and going to create a new character, you'll be presented with some familiar faces if you're experienced with the younger MMO, Final Fantasy XIV. There are in fact many similarities between this game and 14, which you'll see throughout the course of the video. For character creation, your racial choices are Hume, our human stand-ins; Elvan, this world's elves; Taru Taru, a diminutive and mystical race; Mithra, the female-only race if you fancy felines; and Galka, the male-only absolute units. Character creation beyond the choice of race is actually not too extensive. You get a choice between a number of preset faces that come with a preset hairstyle, with only one hair color variant between each face. Also, while on character creation, the camera is constantly moving around dynamically, making it a big show of your in-progress character, which can make it difficult to actually see what your character looks like, particularly the male Humes, which is what I went with. The limited choices make this matter less, but it was still a bit annoying for me. Each race does technically have stat differences, which may have mattered more at some point in the past, but you can get by just fine with any race playing any job. You choose your character's size, which corresponds to their height, but it's impossible to tell the difference in the character creation due to all the camera movement. At least it was for me. You are then presented with the starting jobs, which, like Final Fantasy XIV, is not a permanent choice, and you can change between any unlocked jobs easily once you're in-game. The starting selection is actually the same iconic lineup as the very first Final Fantasy. You've got Warrior, Monk, Thief, and of course the three classic flavors of Mage: Black Mage, White Mage, and Red Mage. Unlike 14, jobs in 11 function more as archetypes with a small selection of unique abilities than the varied gameplay styles of modern MMOs. For example, let's compare Red Mage between 11 and 14. In 14, Red Mage functions uniquely from both White and Black Mage, using different spells and the unique dual spell mechanic to create a very snappy caster experience, which is bookended by some flashy melee flourishes. In 11, Red Mage functions very similarly to the other two mage types, but with the added benefit of being able to use a sword or club for some okay melee damage. Casting spells between the two types of magic are the same throughout, and there are many spells that every mage can use, which we'll get into once I get into combat. Once you've chosen your starting job, you get to name your online avatar and choose a world, aka a server, to join. There are some worlds that are vastly more populated than others, which I'll get into a bit later, and this is also where you can enter a Gold World Pass, which is this game's Refer a Friend system, but apparently used to be the game's way of making sure you and your friends were on the same server back in the day. Lastly, you'll pick your starting nation to begin the game. There are 3 nations to choose from, with each race being more represented in one of them over the others. So if you want to feel like you're actually somewhere you belong, picking the right nation may help. The Republic of Bastok is a nation set in a craggy landscape which makes its name for the successful mining industry of the area, and is home to mostly humans and Galka. The Kingdom of Sandoria boasts a more refined and fortified capital city surrounded by forests where the Ulvan make their home. Finally, the Federation of Windhurst is a haven for the Taru and Mithra, with the city built around a massive tree where all kinds of mysticism goes on. You can choose any city no matter your race, and after progressing somewhat in the game, you can actually do story missions from the other nations that you don't choose relatively easily. I personally went with Bastok since I made a Hume, and it did make me feel like I was in a place that made sense for my character, but the choice is up to you. Once you're logged in, you're greeted by a brief cutscene before being let loose. Quick side note, I actually didn't gather any footage of my early experience because I didn't get the idea for this video until a bit later, but besides that, let's actually now talk about doing anything in this game. This game was primarily designed to be played on a controller, and even on PC, it is intended to be played with a controller. Trust me, it is easier to play this with a controller than to try to adapt it to a mouse and keyboard, at least with how the game is presented without the use of plugins or add-ons, which, by the way, is a similar don't ask, don't tell policy to 14. This game is all about using your directional buttons to navigate menus, and more menus. Opening the menu on the top right of the screen has everything you'll need listed in 2 pages that you can flip between. Everything from missions and quests, regular inventory and key items, system config, party management, magic, social menu, map, you name it, it's all up there. Now this is an MMO after all, so let's get into the meat of the gameplay: combat. This is an MMO from the early 2000s at its core, from just before World of Warcraft arrived and changed what everyone believed MMOs could be going forward. This all means that for combat and a lot of the core game, slow and steady is the name of the game. Now much of the grindier bits of the game have been adjusted over the years, as is normal for a lot of old MMOs, but the game is still by and large pretty slow moving, and the combat is pretty representative of that. To fight an enemy, you first want to select one in the world by either using the D-pad or hitting your select or confirm button, which by default would be circle on a PlayStation controller, but I had swapped to X. After hitting the confirm button again, you'll get another menu to appear in the bottom left with several combat options. Attack begins combat and preps your character to get ready to do melee auto attacks. Magic opens your list of spells that your current job has access to. You select your spell, then select the target, and then you'll begin casting. Abilities opens your lists of actions for things like weapon skills based on the type of weapon you're using, job abilities as well as ranged attacks or things like mounts and commands to pets. Trust is a system that I'll get into in a moment. Selecting items from this menu rather than from the main menu on the top right opens up a list of usable items only, something I did not fully understand until much later. And then there's check, which will check the enemy for its level relative to yours and give you a text prompt to know whether it's about your match, something not even worth your time, or if it will outright kill you. Once you choose to attack something, you'll see 2 new options: switch target, which does exactly what it says, and disengage, which will allow you to stop attacking and run away, which may be the best course of action if you find yourself pulling 5 too many enemies. In combat, you'll have 3 resources to keep an eye on: which will appear on the top left of your screen. HP and MP are probably the two that you will universally recognize, despite the fact that MP is not the blue one. I can assure you though, it's still your mana bar. The third is TP, which stands for Tactical Points. Building up TP is what allows you to do weapon skills. You'll need at least 1,000 to use a skill, but they get more potent the more TP you have, with TP capping at 3,000. And that's pretty much combat. Since it's an older MMO, it's mostly centered around auto-attacking your opponent and using spells or abilities in between when able. If you play a more active job with more micromanagement, or even something that requires a lot of inputs every few minutes, you'll be frantically going through the menus faster than they load off of muscle memory alone once you've played enough. For a while though, it won't be nearly this busy, and combat will be mostly passive until you play a dedicated caster. Everything you do in combat levels up the corresponding skill, another hallmark of older MMO design. Your skill with swords will go up if you use swords, elemental magic will go up if you cast fire a bunch of times, you'll passively level up your evasion and defense as you fight, so playing something more focused around a specific weapon type, like Rune Fencer and their great swords, will be easier to keep up with since you'll be focusing on less skills. Whereas the Jack-of-all-trades Red Mage casts such a wide net that leveling up every skill that they can use will take time. After combat, if you find yourself injured or low on mana, they generally won't regenerate over time by themselves, like other MMOs you might be used to. You'll have to physically type the command/heal to begin the lengthy regeneration time. It'll take a bit for it to even start, and the amount regenerated will increase with every tick. So if you're really low, it may take a short while before you're back to fighting strength. Unlike Final Fantasy XIV, most of your XP is going to come from fighting and defeating monsters instead of quests. Typically, fighting things a few levels higher than yourself will net better XP faster, depending on how fast you can kill things. Partying up with other players would be more helpful, but this MMO has a tool to go at it alone, and that would be the trust system I mentioned earlier. Another term 14 enjoyers may be familiar with. Trusts are summonable NPCs who can fill out a party to fight alongside you. Some of these trusts are ridiculously strong and, I won't lie, carried me through the story, especially these two, Valenarel the Paladin and the Be Not Afraid biblically accurate Super Saiyan Shantoto. Trusts are unlocked via a brief series of quests that you can do very early on, with some trusts, like this version of Shantoto, being available elsewhere like the Longed bonus vendor. There is a new player guide that I've linked in the description that I will talk a bit more about later, but that guide does detail some of the better trusts to scoop up and a step-by-step process for unlocking the system as a whole. Now this is a Final Fantasy game, so there are jobs, and all jobs have their own individual level, just like in 14, but there is also something called the sub-job system. Unlocking sub-jobs allows you to equip a second job that will carry some of its benefits, but it will be scaled down to be only at half the level of your main job while equipped. This is dead useful, especially for equipping some really nice utility spells like Invisible and Sneak, but I'm sure there are more uses out there that I'd barely scratched the surface of what sub-jobs can do. The job selection ranges from Final Fantasy mainstays to things you might have never heard of before. While I did play Red Mage for a good while, eventually I decided to switch to something that is currently not available in other games, or at the very least in 14. Might as well try something unique while I'm here, you know? I won't lie, I almost chose Puppet Master, because it looks hilarious and also very cool at the same time, but I did eventually settle on Rune Knight, which does technically have some similarities with other jobs from older Final Fantasy games like Mystic Knight, but it is still unique enough for my liking. Jobs all have their own quests to do as well, some much harder than others, to obtain their job equipment. So how do you even change jobs in this game? Well, you can't do it on the fly like in 14, and instead you have to go to your Mog Home, which is an instanced player house that everyone has access to. The Mog Home is also your storage, allowing you to deposit gear into your Mog wardrobe and then equip anywhere, as well as eventually gaining access to a couple other features like a personal farm for materials. Now, this is the gameplay segment of the video, but I've already gone on for a while about a bunch of stuff other than combat. And the fact of the matter is, this is an MMO, and there are so many little things to learn. There's the Record of Eminence system, which will supply you with gear while leveling. Teleportation around the world in the form of crystals and also tomes that are found out in zones. How to do things like trading. It's a whole lot, and I won't go over everything here. Playing this game with a guide is pretty much essential, and I'll talk a bit more about using guides later. And I'm not kidding, it took me 3 different guides just to play through the game successfully, but there is a lot of support out there. The Reddit is really active, and I'm sure there are plenty of Discords, And somewhat surprising to me, there were actually a ton of players in the cities at all times. Help is out there. Now, to give the gameplay a score, and trying to be fair, this is kinda tough. When this game released back in 02, this kind of gameplay was normal for MMOs, and the fact that it all worked on the controller, and being the first cross-platform MMO, I'm sure it was an amazing technical feat. But all of that good stuff does not negate the fact that this game is kind of a pain to play moment to moment. I'm sorry if you're a long-time 11 player. I'm not saying that you're wrong for liking the combat or slow gameplay. It's just very slow and tedious. 2 out of 5 is the score for gameplay, since navigating menus is basically the thing you do for the whole game. Again, I'm not saying you guys are wrong for liking 11. This game is legendary. It's just that the gameplay was not the thing that kept me playing. Which moves us on to our next segment, narrative. In this series, narrative does not just mean the plot of the story itself, but also includes things like the setting, how the world looks and feels, and the world building. Huge spoilers going forward. Once I get to discussing the score, spoilers will be over, so skip to the timestamp in the description. Another side note, this game is huge, and has several expansions worth of story to play through, as well as smaller content updates that also include smaller storylines. For the sake of this video's length, I will only go over the story of the base game, and may in the future release additional videos just going over the narrative of each expansion, as sort of expansions to this video. So without further ado, let's begin. Final Fantasy XI's story takes place on the world of Vana'diel, about 20 years after a brutal conflict called the Crystal War between the allied nations and mortal races of the world and the enigmatic Shadow Lord and his equally varied army of beastmen. Although the Shadow Lord was defeated, beastmen still remain throughout the world, and to assist in combating them on a smaller scale, the 3 nations of Bastok, Sandoria, and Windhurst elected to hire adventurers rather than risk too many of their own soldiers, presumably because not too many were left after the war. Thus began the Age of Adventurers. The story begins with your character arriving in the city of your choosing, where you basically get the standard level 1 adventurer treatment. Go here, fetch this thing, kill some boars in Elwyn Forest, you know, the age-old get me my bare asses adventurer. This bit of story basically introduces you to some characters you'll be seeing a lot more of. For myself, who chose Bastok, I got to hang out with a cast of Humes and Gulka in a faction called the Mithril Musketeers, which included none other than this game's version of Cid. This part of the story is largely uneventful, and things don't really start happening until a bit later. For example, the first thing you do in Bastok is retrieving a mining foreman's report from the local mines, and then delivering it directly to the president of Bastok's assistant, Lucius. There's some mention in the report about someone called the Tailkeeper returning to the Gulka, who seems to be kind of like a spiritual leader, who supposedly holds all the memories of their race, since they kind of exist via reincarnation. This does begin to kind of set up the idea of racial tension between Humes and Gulka, which will only really become relevant much later. For my second task, I was sent by Cid to test the water acidity in a nearby hot springs canyon called Dangraf Wadi. After returning, the results don't seem to matter as much as an introduction of another character by the name of Volker, the captain of the Mithril Musketeers. He and Cid seem to be good friends and do a bit of catching up before Cid remembers I exist and gives me a pat on the back for another mission well done. My next assignment had me collect pieces of a beastman fetish from the local Quadav, tortoise-like beastmen who appear in the region surrounding Bastok, and cause the nation a fair bit of grief. This mission apparently has multiple ending dialogues depending on who you turn it into, and is also repeatable. The next assignment is when things start to get slightly more interesting. Upon accepting my next assignment, I was sent to meet with the president himself, who, by all appearances at this point in the story, is a bit of a tool. Anyways, the man conscripts me to go and visit the 2 other starting nations of Sandoria and Windhurst, to both help them out and also get the inside scoop of how each nation is faring internally. Traveling to Sandoria first, in the Bastok consulate, I run into a character who will quickly become a familiar face, an adventurer named Lion. Lion tells me of her concerns regarding the orcs, the beast tribe causing trouble in these parts, and that they seem to be much more well equipped and organized than usual, as if someone in the background is pulling strings. Meeting with an extremely pretentious Alvan to formally assign us the mission, I travel to an orc outpost and defeat a war chief named Vatgit at the peak, who goes down pretty quickly thanks to my trusty trusts, and then I head back to Sandoria to report a successful excursion. After all that, it's on to Windhurst, where I learn that some kind of ferocious beast has been terrorizing the local beast tribe, the Yagudo, and I am tasked to investigate this beast to maintain the strained but somewhat amicable relationship between Windhurst and the Yagudo. After trekking deep into Yagudo territory, I'm greeted with a scene of a Mithra facing off with a floating eyeball who taunts her by claiming that he was the one responsible for all the ferocious beast reports. After declaring he will be the one to rally the beast tribes, the Searcher then summons a dragon of darkness to combat the lone Mithra, who promptly falls back and allows us to take down the beast instead. After giving this fiend a swift beatdown, Lion arrives on the scene and informs us that this dragon is something that hasn't really been around since the Shadow Lord was defeated 20 years prior. The Searcher then blindsides Lion by proudly proclaiming the Shadow Lord's imminent return, to which Lion implores me to report back to Backlog as fast as I can. After returning, President Karst takes this news pretty well actually, and sends his assistant to make sure the Mithril Musketeers are ready for a combat assignment against the local Quadovs. So, I team up with some of the Musketeers and head to the Quadov stronghold, where I spend some time bashing in some heads. After a successful skirmish, one other adventurer who joined this strike on the Beastmen remarks that this mission seemed to be a test of some kind to determine which adventurers would be best suited for something more difficult, and it seems that I passed this test with flying colors, as Lucius, the President's assistant, later informs me that I was unanimously chosen for the next assignment, which will finally take me to the great city of Juno, a city that in multiple ways feels like the main hub of the entire game. And Juno is pretty grand. Anyway, arriving at the Bastok consulate in Juno, we learn that the ambassador is out investigating a location called Delkfut Tower, which is supposedly pretty dangerous, so I found it odd that an ambassador would go there himself. After journeying to and through this nightmare tower, we find the ambassador a little shaken, but none the worse for wear. Meeting back up with him in Juno, he assigns us as the attaché of the Bastok embassy, and hints that he has another assignment in mind for us. This next assignment in question is a doozy. To get the particulars, we get to meet with the Archduke of Juno himself, and I might butcher these next couple names, Kamlanot and his eye-patched little brother, Eildnark. Eildnarki? I have no idea. I think it's Eildnark. More on this little shit later. This character, Kamlanot, by the way, is one of 3 characters I recognized in this game when starting. In this case, thanks to Dissidia, the Final Fantasy arcade fighting game that features characters from all across the Final Fantasy franchise. The 2 brothers inform me that the Beast Tribes are indeed trying to bring the Shadow Lord back, and that they're using a substance called Magicite to do it. I'm tasked with finding 3 pieces of Magicite to, I guess, stop them? There's a whole lot of Magicite at each location I grab them from, but hey, he's Archduke and not me. I also meet with Aldo, the leader of an underground organization called the Tenshodo, who gives me the rundown on all the locations I'll be visiting in this Magicite collection operation. We are interrupted, however, by his younger sister Verena, who is troubled by the Archduke's recent proclamation to eject any beastmen from the city. She sees the beastmen as people worthy of befriending, and even often hangs out with a goblin named Fikblix. Fikblix later leaves the city, much to Verena's dismay, to see if they can parlay with the more aggressive beastmen out there, to prevent any further conflict. With that bit of drama out the way, we leave the confines of the city to gather some Magicite. At each site, when retrieving the substance, I am subjected to visions of the past, similar to the Echo from Final Fantasy XIV, which paints a picture of a group of adventurers investigating the Northlands at some unspecified time in the past. Summarizing this a bit, we see the Galka of the group, named Ralgrim, betrayed by one of the Humes, a former musketeer named Ulrich. Before the final blow can be dealt, another Hume named Cornelia takes the blow instead, and dies in the arms of Ralgrim. This will be extremely relevant later. At some point, while traveling to the Magicite locations, we happen upon a sad scene of an injured Fikblix, and Verena arrives as well. Not sure how she got there by herself, to be honest. Fikblix preaches one more time that although their efforts were for naught, understanding each other could prevent war, and not to hate the beastmen who did this. Moving on, after viewing the third memory, Lion catches up with us and we are greeted by a Spectre of Darkness, a ghostly image of the Shadow Lord himself. He announces his returned power and rebirth to Vana'diel, and Lion promptly advises that we report back to base immediately. After delivering the Magicite to Kamlanot, we learn that all 3 of the other nations have been attacked by beastmen, and we prepare to return to our home nation for a status update. Before that though, the smaller of the 2 brothers, Eildnark, makes a request to his attendant to summon Verena, seemingly interested in how a Hume could foster peace with beastmen. A slightly ominous summons, to be sure. Heading back to Bastok, we hear that the president's office was broken into, which also involved breaking through some magical defenses as well. The target of the break-in was not the president himself, but a talisman, one of 3 given to each nation, that act as keys to a seal placed on the Shadow Lord following his defeat 20 years ago. We're conscripted for a recon mission to the Shadow Lord's very own territory, the Northlands, to see if the magic seal in an ancient ruin called Feyin, a remnant of an ancient civilization called Zillart, is still intact. Arriving in Feyin, we run into Lion again, and also another, a Galka Dark Knight by the name of Zaid, who will also become a recurring character. We catch them in a conversation about how the similarities to what is going on now to an old song about warriors of the crystal who would banish the darkness. After fighting through the tower and arriving to where the seal should be, Zaid remarks that the seal doesn't appear to be around, meaning it was probably already broken. Returning home, I learn that Zaid is actually the one who defeated the Shadow Lord 20 years ago, and is technically the number 2 musketeer currently. With the broken seal reported, plans begin to be put together for an incursion on the Shadow Lord's previous seat of power, a fortress in the north called Castle's Val. After a time, we return to get ready for the attack plan, only to learn that the Bastok Senate has in fact voted not to get involved with this conflict, hoping to spare its resources and declaring that the Alvan of Sandoria should be the ones to handle this. I can't imagine why anyone would hate the Alvan of Sandoria. Unable to assist in an official capacity, the Musketeers give me the lay of the land for Castle's Val, and since I'm not technically part of the Bastok military, I'm free to do whatever I want. To stop the Shadow Lord from returning, I make the grueling trek through the frigid north and eventually the castle itself, to arrive at what I suppose could be considered the throne room. Zaid enters with me, but we're too late. The Shadow Lord appears and then reveals his true identity, the Gulka from that expedition decades prior, Raugrim. After Cornelia's death, Raugrim underwent this gruesome transformation some time after, fueled by the rage and fury of all the Gulka and revenge towards the rest of the world. And so begins the final battle, a battle that apparently, back in the day, was not even beaten until the level cap was raised for the very first time, from 50 to 55. Even me at level 50 and these very strong trusts at my side cut it very close. Immediately after defeating the Shadow Lord, things get a bit weird. The cutscene you're greeted with shows Raugrim surfacing from beneath the form of the Shadow Lord, where he and Zaid have one last moment as he lets go of his rage and passes on, while Lion appears to usher us out of the room as it collapses. Afterwards, we all go our separate ways as adventurers do, and it's a decent end to a classical fantasy story. However, if you start the first expansion, the cutscene replays as a flashback, where the events are dramatically different, setting up the next conflict. The funniest part is that this flashback is framed as something that was so traumatic, your character just memory hold it. I found this very funny, and although the first expansion, Rise of the Zillart, continues from the base game story quite well, I won't be covering it here because this video is long enough as it is, but perhaps in a future video. Spoiler section over, so let's talk about my thoughts on the base game narrative. And yes, all of you FF11 veterans out there, I know the story gets really wild in some future expansions, but like I said, this video is long enough already, so we'll be sticking to the base game for now. I will try to be fair here and take into account that this is an MMO and story for an MMO from 2002 that was also on the PS2. So the way that it feels kind of disjointed and a little bit hollow at points with just not enough meat is being taken into account. Some aspects of the plot, such as characters introduced like Zaid specifically, feel very out of place with almost no narrative setup, especially considering some of Square's previous single-player Final Fantasies from before 11. Again though, this is an MMO that had to run on the PS2, so this is something I can kind of cut some slack for. Thinking about World of Warcraft that would release in 2004, there really isn't too much of an overarching plot for Vanilla WoW either, just a ton of smaller stories that sometimes connect, which is definitely a bigger focus on the world and how it is at the time. Now the actual story of 11, or at least the one that they were trying to tell, is quite solid. Classic fantasy, as I mentioned before. A story of betrayal and revenge motivated by jealousy and racial prejudice, international politics between the three nations as well as Juno, magical mysteries, an established history and then building off of that history, it is impressive given the type of game and era this is. I can't give it a 5 out of 5 though, so I will instead give it a 4, propped up with the considerations I already mentioned. Now of course, the base game is only the beginning, as there is so much more story to tell. If there are any more story additions to this video, you'll see them linked here and in the description, but until I get around to doing that, we'll just move on to the next segment, presentation. This section ties together all the aesthetic and mechanical bits that define the look and feel of the game, outside of specifically combat and the written story. That said, how does an MMO from 2002, designed for the PlayStation 2, feel to play? Well, like I mentioned a bit earlier, clunky, slow, and absolutely full of menus. Everything is in menus, which does kind of make this MMO feel more like a playable database, more so than any other MMO I've played before, which really are all playable databases if you think about it. It's not great, and there are also delays when choosing actions and starting combat, which just makes it feel even worse. Not to mention, navigating the world can be a bit of a pain for a bit until you get used to how things work. Zones do have maps, but they're not known by you by default, and you'll have to pick up magical maps for every zone as you play, with most purchasable maps covering more than one zone. Fast traveling can be expensive without completing a specific quest first, which I'll get into in a little bit. The auction house is a slog to use too, with no way to filter past the category of an item, so you'll just have to scroll until you find what you need. I've said it before, but using multiple guides to piece together how the game works is almost completely necessary, which I know is a huge turnoff for many. There are so many little things in this game with it being an MMO, and I can't cover everything, but mechanically everything is pretty similar to each other in terms of slowness and just not being user-friendly. Back in the day, this would have been a game that you were expected to read the manual for. Now, stepping away mechanically and going to the aesthetics of the game, visually, it's actually pretty nice. I say it holds up quite well. There are tons of varied locations and zones from so many years of adding content, with some pretty unique sights to see. Take these ancient structures that you'll find dotted around the world that almost look like they're made of bone. Very cool. You've got your jungles, deserts, snowfields, arid crags, volcanoes, spooky fortresses of darkness, dead landscapes with no color. Hell, even the starting cities are starkly different from one another. Like many MMOs that have run for years, you are spoiled for choice, and they are all filled with monsters and creatures that you would expect to find in a Final Fantasy game, with some using the same model as their counterparts from 14. The music is also very Final Fantasy, with the base game score created by several composers, including the legendary Nobuo Uematsu himself. So aesthetically, the game checks all the boxes for feeling like a good old traditional Final Fantasy, while mechanically it's clunky as all hell. Taking both of these things into account, I'll give the presentation a 3 out of 5 because the music and the visual presentation is just that good. This means that playing this for the first time in the year 2024 and then 2025, out of a maximum of 15, Final Fantasy XI scores a 9. This game is legendary for being Final Fantasy's first online foray, and at the time provided an experience to console gamers that they never would have experienced before. Considerations and limitations had to be put in place to allow the game to work on PS2, which was fine at the time, but has passively harmed the game's playability in regards to modern standards, which would prevent prospective players from enjoying an otherwise solid story, beautiful world, and an important place in gaming history. The video is not quite over yet, because before wrapping up, I wanted to go over some things to keep in mind before and during your time with this game, should you decide to take the plunge. By now you can probably tell that Final Fantasy XI is pretty obtuse and an absolute pain to wrap your head around if you're coming from modern MMOs, especially Final Fantasy XIV, if you came to play the game as a way to sort of appreciate the crossover raid in 14 that is 11 themed more, like me. Even the sign-up process to begin playing is a huge pain, and that's why I cannot stress enough that playing this game with a walkthrough or guide is so important for your enjoyment. If you get frustrated because you can't even log in to experience what is here, then that's a damn shame. So looking for help to get up and running is extremely helpful. I watched this fantastic video made by a YouTuber named SoberDwarf, who excellently details every aspect of getting into the game, including buying it, registering, logging in, and recommendations for getting started. I also followed 2 written guides on the Final Fantasy XI wiki to help getting started and progressing to level 99, and then to guide me through every mission to complete the story. The video and 2 guides are both in the description. When you actually get into the game, there are some other things to take into account. In terms of player population, there's actually surprisingly plenty of people still around. If you want a server with a decent population, you have 3 prominent options. Asura is server number 1, with the largest active player base by far, while also suffering from all the usual negative MMO things like bots, gold sellers, the works. If you want to feel like you're playing a modern MMO in terms of activity, you'll want to go here. After Asura, the 2 alternatives are Bahamut and Odin. Odin seems to be where most of the Japanese player base hangs out, but there are communication tools in the game to facilitate cross-region interaction. Bahamut is like a less intense version of Asura, but still has a sizable enough population to really feel like you're playing a multiplayer game. Bahamut is also the server I chose, and there were no shortage on players around. At one point I asked on Reddit for advice on gearing between levels 50 to 98, and a very helpful dude named Dumo just showed up and found me while I was out grinding levels, and he gave me a full set of level 75 armor almost unprompted. What a legend. Thanks, Dumo. There is one other thing to keep in mind when hopping into Final Fantasy XI. The very last content update that the game added is something called Rhapsodies of Vana'diel. At the time, it was supposed to be kind of like a storyline that pulls all the story threads together from all the previous expansions as a sort of last hurrah for Final Fantasy XI, since development on new content updates was stopping. These Rhapsodies quests are kind of a double-edged sword. You would think that because it's the last content update and it kind of pulls together a lot of stories from throughout the game's life, that you should play it last, since it will introduce you to characters and concepts that you might not be familiar with, and then those characters greet you like they've known you for a while, so you figure, okay, I'll save this until the end. Well, the unfortunate thing is that the Rhapsodies of Vana'diel quests are some of the most rewarding quests in the entire game, and I'm not just talking about in-game money or experience or anything. These quests literally unlock features for you, or activate massive quality of life improvements. For instance, completing the first Rhapsodies of Vana'diel questline awards you with a key item called Rhapsody in White, which, among other things, allows you to equip a sub-job, but also reduces the price of teleporting around the map by a staggering amount. I'm talking from like 1,000 to 100. So many people do believe that these Rhapsodies of Vana'diel quests are essential to do as you play through the game, even though it kind of feels like you're doing stuff out of order. I held off on doing these for the entire base game, and because of that, there were a lot of quality of life improvements that I just did not have unlocked. Eventually, I did cave and do, I believe, the first 2 to unlock some of their rewards, because it was helping me with not only the Red Mage job gear, but also when I leveled all the way up to 99, and I needed to do stuff to get the Rune Knight equipment. So it's really up to your discretion, but I do recommend at least doing the first 2 to get the first 2 Rhapsody items. Just try to memory hole a little bit of what the plot is, and then kind of refresh yourself about it later when you've completed all the other stories. There are plenty of other quality of life improvements that the later quests unlock, but I didn't go that far. If you're someone who, like me, wanted to give 11 a swing for completion's sake, to be able to say, I've played all the Final Fantasies, or at least all the numbered ones, this will likely be your greatest hurdle. It has definitely been mine. The game is still available to purchase and does have a monthly subscription, and is even on Steam, and the complete edition goes on sale pretty frequently, so you can literally just buy it and eventually start playing. But actually playing is not going to be for everyone. Even those who like MMOs might be put off, and that's okay. It's going to take dedication and a strong love for Final Fantasy to see you through. There is so much more to talk about in this game, but the script and video are long enough already, so I am more than happy to answer any questions about my experience in general in the comments. I didn't hate my time in Vana'diel, and at the time of writing I've completed only the base game and the first expansion, Rise of Zillar, and decided to take a break. Playing this old but legendary MMO has only increased my appreciation for not just 14, but just Final Fantasy in general, and also just MMOs in general. It's up to you to decide whether you have the patience and mental fortitude to experience Vana'diel, but seeing as the complete edition comes with 30 days of game time, and you can regularly pick up the whole package for just $10 on sale, I say it's at least worth a look. And with that, it's time to draw this video to a close. This first episode is probably going to be a lot longer than future ones since it covered an MMO, but I think that's fine. To recap, across gameplay, narrative, and presentation, I scored Final Fantasy XI a 9 out of 15. This one definitely requires patience, dedication, and a love for Final Fantasy, and a willingness to learn archaic gameplay systems, but you are rewarded with a historic video game that continues to endure to this day. If you enjoyed listening to me ramble on about my experience playing this game and look forward to more, like the video to let me know, and subscribe to stick around. If you watched all the way through, you're a legend. While I've still got plenty of Final Fantasy XI to go, I can still say that my name is Nazarbro, and that's another game off my backlog.